Give us your take on the Chinese regime. They've taken a fairly extreme position. We're just not going to let it in the country. And they're having a lot of success, but not 100%.
That's true. Frankly, they're taking COVID probably more seriously than any other country I can think of. I mean, zero lockdown is pretty serious. My Chinese friends tell me they don't mind zero lockdown. That is, they don't mind the inconvenience. They're tested virtually every time they turn around, and they can't travel near as much as they'd like to. For example, within China, it's difficult to go in and out of Beijing because of Beijing's the capital and there are more COVID cases in China. On the other hand, there are adverse consequences. Because of the lockdown in China, COVID, frankly, is much more under control, obviously, than other parts of the world. But because of the lockdown, there are food shortages, there are inconveniences in China. Now there are going to be, I think, further supply chain disruptions. That's going to have adverse consequences economically in China, but also for the United States, because our supply chain is going to be a bit disrupted. So I take my hat off to how strongly China's working on this, better than we are, frankly, by far. But there's no free lunch. There are consequences.
Well, talk about the economic consequences particularly. What effect is it going to have on the growth pattern in China? They already were struggling a little bit. I mean, struggling for them, it looks good for the rest of the world, but still, compared to what they have been doing, it appears that President Xi is willing to give up some economic growth in order to beat this COVID.
I think he is. I can remember, it wasn't too many years ago, China's growth rate was 10, 12%. That was under then Premier Zhu Rongji, and that helped enable China to get in the WTO. And slowly, that growth rate's been coming down. But it's important to remember that during the financial crisis in 08, we were negative, but China was still positive in their growth rate. But I think President Xi is looking at the Beijing Olympics. He is doing all he possibly can to present his country in a positive light. That means controlling COVID to a large degree. And so it's just he's willing to suffer some of the economic downturns as long as he can get COVID under control. I think he thinks he can do both at once, but COVID is probably a little more important right now to him.
So you mentioned the Olympics. There also is that Lunar New Year, which is a really big deal in China. I at least, as an American, I marvel at their ability to shut down the country in the face of that. Can you imagine what would happen back in the United States if this happened? I mean, people would be marching in the streets. Is that just because he is such an authoritative figure, an autocrat, as it were?
I think it's partly because he's authoritative, he's autocratic, but also it's the Chinese people. The Chinese people are used to that. Don't forget, they've lived under emperors for thousands of years, where the emperor controls everything. And emperors in China do well when the people do well, and emperors in China don't do well when the people don't do well. So he's doing all he can to help the people do well. And that means, as much as possible, helping raise incomes, address air and water pollution, better health care, for example, raise the poverty level. So he's working very, very hard. And that's what really counts to him.
So, Mr. Ambassador, I think we can't talk about the Olympics over there without at least mentioning what's going on with the Uyghurs, because a lot of people are really withholding. We're not sending a diplomatic delegation. No officials in the United States are going over. We have certain athletes who are speaking out against it. There's a lot of pressure on the International Olympic Committee to do more than it's doing. Does that have any effect within China, within the regime, or is that simply a Western phenomenon? I
think you put your finger on it. We, of course, very strongly stand up for human rights. But when we impose sanctions on China, by and large, the Chinese just don't care. It's just water off the back of a duck. It's not going to change. Sanctions will not change China's behavior. Not sending a delegation over to the Olympics will not change China's behavior. On the other hand, it is an expression of Americans standing up for values. I think that's very important worldwide, for America as much as possible be the beacon on the hill. Now, we're not so shiny bright ourselves sometimes, and other countries point that out. But we should still talk about human rights, But we must be honest that when we sanction other countries on human rights, it has no effect on China's behavior, none whatsoever.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, I'm mindful of the fact that you served with Harry Reid, the gentleman who was the Senate Majority Leader for 8 years, the longest of anybody other than 2 other people in history. Why don't you spend a minute just reminiscing about Harry Reid, who was laying state just yesterday in the Capitol Rotunda?
I loved Harry Reid. He was one of the most genuine persons I've had the privilege to know. Totally honest. His word is his bond. Totally. That meant he's also totally loyal. He's very loyal to you and you to him. He would go out of his way to help you in the best sense of the term. Frankly, when I decided not to run again for the U.S. Senate, and decided maybe I wanted to be the U.S. ambassador to China because I care so much about the U.S.-China relationship, I told Harry Reid, he said, gee, Max, let me see what I can do to help you there. I'm going to call the vice president. I'll call Vice President Biden. He's very close to Obama. I'll tell Biden to put in a good word for you. I'll help you get that job. That's Harry Reid. He also is very religious, but he didn't wear it on his sleeve. He would read scripture, New Testament, Old Testament, the Book of Mormon. He's very good Mormon with his family and a church and tithed. He's also a pragmatist. He wasn't a cause guy. He just tried to get solutions. And he really is a good example of what we need in Washington today. Hardworking, very hardworking, honest, smart, but trying to get solutions, trying to get agreements. He would talk to McConnell 2 or 3 times a day, trying to reach some agreements. They didn't always reach agreements, but in the Senate, it's very important for the 2 of them to talk together like that. And Harry Reid was one of the best.